There comes a point in every empath's life that from the outside looks like everything is falling apart, but inside feels strangely peaceful. It does not arrive with loud warnings or dramatic endings. It enters quietly, almost unnoticed. One day, you are still carrying the emotions, stress, and problems of everyone around you, trying to make sure nobody feels alone, and the next day, you are sitting calmly while everything around you changes. You are no longer rushing to rescue people from their emotions. You are no longer losing sleep trying to solve problems that were never yours to carry. And the strange part is that instead of guilt, you feel relief. Instead of panic, you feel space opening inside your chest for the very first time in years. Most people misunderstand this moment completely. They assume the empath has become distant, uncaring, or emotionally shut down. But that is not what is happening at all. The empath has not lost their sensitivity. They still notice every shift in tone, every hidden emotion, every unspoken sadness in a room. They still feel deeply. The difference is that they no longer believe they are required to save everyone they understand. That belief finally dies, and when it dies, a completely different version of the empath begins to appear. A calmer version, a stronger version, a version that finally understands the difference between compassion and self-destruction. For the first time, they realized that constantly carrying other people's pain was never proof of love. It was proof that they had forgotten themselves. For most of their life, the empath survives by becoming emotionally useful to everyone around them. Usually this pattern begins very early. They become the child who senses tension before anyone speaks, the child who learns to read moods instead of relaxing, the child who feels responsible for keeping peace inside the home. While other children are simply learning who they are, the empath is learning who everyone else needs them to be. They become observant, careful, emotionally intelligent beyond their age. Adults praise them for being mature, understanding, thoughtful, and caring. But beneath all those compliments is a dangerous lesson slowly forming inside them. Their value comes from helping others emotionally survive. As they grow older, this pattern only becomes stronger. Friendships become one-sided counseling sessions. Relationships turn into emotional caretaking jobs. Family members begin leaning on them in ways that slowly drain the life out of them. And because the empath genuinely cares, they rarely complain. In fact, they often convince themselves that being needed gives their life meaning. They become the person everyone calls during a crisis, the person who answers late-night messages, the person who notices when someone says, "I'm fine," while secretly falling apart inside. And for years they believe this role is simply who they are. They believe love means sacrifice. They believe compassion means exhaustion. They believe boundaries are selfish. The world often rewards empaths for abandoning themselves. People admire their patience while ignoring the cost of it. They praise their kindness while depending on it endlessly. The empath slowly becomes emotional oxygen for everyone around them. But nobody stops to ask what happens when the oxygen runs out. Nobody notices how tired they are becoming because empaths become experts at hiding exhaustion behind understanding smiles. They continue showing up even when they are empty inside. They continue comforting others while silently breaking in private. And the saddest part is that many empaths do not even realize how deeply disconnected they have become from themselves until they reach complete emotional burnout. That breaking point rarely arrives through one dramatic betrayal. Usually it happens through repetition, through years of tiny disappointments stacking on top of each other. The friend who disappears when you need support, the partner who expects endless understanding but offers none in return, the family member who treats your kindness like an unlimited resource. Each experience leaves another small crack inside the empath's spirit. Still, they keep going. They explain away bad behavior. They forgive too quickly. They carry relationships almost entirely on their own shoulders because they fear losing connection more than losing themselves. But eventually, the emotional debt becomes too heavy to ignore. Eventually, something inside them reaches its limit. Then comes the moment that changes everything. It may happen during an argument, or during a lonely night when they suddenly realize nobody truly sees them. It may happen while listening to someone complain for the 100th time without ever asking how they are doing. Or maybe it happens in silence, while staring at themselves in a mirror and noticing how exhausted their eyes have become. And suddenly something clicks into place. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity, a deep and painful understanding that they have spent years pouring energy into people who were comfortable receiving but unwilling to give. And once that realization fully settles into the empath's mind, they can never return to who they used to be. This is the part that confuses people the most. When the empath stops overgiving, others often interpret it as cruelty. The same people who once depended on their endless emotional availability suddenly accuse them of changing. They say the empath has become cold, distant, selfish, or detached. But what they are actually witnessing is an empath finally learning self-respect. They are seeing someone choose peace over performance. They are seeing someone stop abandoning themselves for approval. And for people who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries, that transformation feels threatening. Because once the empath wakes up, the old emotional arrangements stop working. The empath also experiences confusion during this phase. At first, the silence feels unfamiliar. They are so used to constantly monitoring everyone else's emotions that focusing on themselves almost feels wrong. They may question whether they are becoming heartless. They may wonder why they suddenly feel tired of conversations that once consumed their entire energy. But slowly they begin noticing something important. Their nervous system is calmer, their thoughts are clearer, their body feels lighter. They no longer carry the invisible weight of trying to rescue every struggling person they meet. And in that newfound space, they begin rediscovering parts of themselves that were buried beneath years of emotional labor. One of the hardest lessons empaths learn is that understanding someone's pain does not automatically mean tolerating their behavior. For years, they confused empathy with obligation. If they understood why someone acted badly, they felt guilty setting boundaries against them. But maturity changes this perspective completely. The empath eventually realizes that compassion without limits becomes self-abandonment. Understanding trauma does not require accepting mistreatment. Loving someone does not require sacrificing your mental peace. And supporting people should never require destroying yourself in the process. These truths sound obvious to healthy people, but for many empaths, they feel revolutionary because their identity was built around emotional self-sacrifice. As the empath changes, their relationships begin changing too. Some connections naturally grow stronger because genuine people respect healthy boundaries. But many relationships quietly fall apart. Not because the empath became cruel, but because the relationship only worked when the empath ignored their own needs. This can be deeply painful. The empath may realize that certain people never truly loved them for who they were. They loved the access they had to the empath's energy, patience, forgiveness, and emotional support. Once those things are no longer freely available, the relationship starts collapsing under its own imbalance. That realization hurts deeply, but it also brings freedom because truth always removes illusion. There is also a strange loneliness that appears during this stage of awakening. The empath may spend time alone, not because they hate people, but because they finally understand the value of protecting their peace. Solitude stops feeling empty and starts feeling safe. Silence becomes healing instead of uncomfortable. They no longer feel the need to constantly explain themselves or chase emotional closeness with people who cannot meet them halfway. For perhaps the first time in their life, they understand that peace is more valuable than attention. And once an empath truly experiences inner peace, it becomes impossible to willingly return to emotional chaos disguised as love. What makes this transformation so powerful is that the empath does not lose their softness. They still care deeply. They still love deeply. They still notice suffering around them. But now their compassion includes themselves too. That is the difference. Before, their empathy flowed outward endlessly while they remained emotionally starving inside. Now there is balance. They listen without absorbing. They support without rescuing. They love without disappearing into another person's needs. This version of the empath is far stronger than the exhausted version people were familiar with. Because true strength is not endless sacrifice. True strength is remaining kind while finally refusing to betray yourself anymore. Many people never expect the empath to change because they become comfortable with the empath always understanding, always forgiving, always staying. So when the empath finally walks away from draining situations, others are shocked. But the empath is not leaving out of hate. They are leaving because survival sometimes requires distance. They are leaving because constantly carrying everyone else's emotional weight nearly destroyed them. And after years of feeling emotionally overwhelmed, they finally understand something life-changing. They are not responsible for healing every wounded person they encounter. Some people must face themselves without using the empath as a shield from accountability. The awakened empath becomes much quieter in certain ways. They stop explaining their boundaries repeatedly. They stop arguing with people determined to misunderstand them. They stop chasing relationships that require them to shrink themselves emotionally. Instead, they become observant, intentional. protective of their energy. And surprisingly, this new version often intimidates people more than the endlessly giving version ever did. Because calm boundaries reveal strength, the empath no longer reacts to manipulation the same way. Guilt stops controlling them. Emotional pressure stops working. They finally understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Eventually, the empath realizes something that changes the entire direction of their life. The ability to deeply understand people is a gift, but only when paired with wisdom. Without wisdom, empathy becomes a doorway to emotional exhaustion. Without boundaries, compassion becomes a form of self-erasure. And without self-respect, love turns into survival instead of connection. The empath's true awakening begins the moment they stop asking, "How can I save everyone else?" and start asking, "Why have I spent so many years abandoning myself?" That question changes everything because once they begin answering it honestly, they can never return to the version of themselves that existed only to carry others. And maybe that is why this transformation feels so misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like the empath stopped caring. But the truth is far deeper than that. They did not stop caring about people. They simply stopped caring more about everyone else than they cared about themselves. They stopped believing their worth depended on endless sacrifice. They stopped confusing suffering with love. And in doing so, they finally became free. The day the empath finally stops caring does not actually mean they stop feeling love, concern, or emotional connection. That is the misunderstanding people immediately jump toward because they only notice the change on the surface. What really happens is much deeper and far more meaningful. For the first time in their entire life, the empath redirects some of that endless care inward. Instead of pouring every ounce of emotional energy into other people, they begin asking themselves questions they were once too afraid to even consider. What if my emotions deserve attention too? What if my exhaustion matters? What if constantly draining myself for everyone else was never kindness, but a habit built from fear, guilt, and survival? Those questions begin quietly, but once they appear, they change everything forever. For years, the empath lived as if their purpose was to emotionally rescue everyone around them. They believed love meant availability at all times. They believed compassion meant saying yes no matter how tired they were. If someone suffered, the empath immediately felt responsible for easing that pain, even when doing so damaged their own mental and emotional health. This pattern became so normal that they rarely questioned it. They simply accepted emotional overextension as part of their personality. But eventually, something inside them becomes impossible to ignore. Their body grows exhausted. Their mind becomes overwhelmed. Their spirit begins feeling empty. And slowly they start realizing that caring deeply should not require abandoning themselves in the process. That realization feels revolutionary because most empaths were never taught healthy emotional balance. They were taught responsibility before boundaries. They learned how to understand others before understanding themselves. Many of them became experts at reading emotions because their environments required it. They learned to notice tension quickly, calm conflict quickly, and emotionally adapt quickly. Over time, they became so focused on everyone else's inner world that they lost connection with their own. Their feelings became secondary. Their needs became negotiable. Their exhaustion became invisible even to themselves. So, when the empath finally begins protecting their own peace, it feels unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because they are doing something they were never trained to do. They are finally valuing themselves equally. This is the true awakening. The empath begins understanding that feeling someone's pain does not automatically mean carrying it for them. They realize there is a major difference between support and sacrifice. They can listen without absorbing. They can care without rescuing. They can love without destroying themselves emotionally. This distinction changes the entire structure of their relationships because suddenly they are no longer operating from guilt. They are no longer saying yes simply because someone expects them to. Instead, they become intentional with their energy. They start asking whether a relationship is mutual, healthy, respectful, and emotionally balanced. And many connections that once felt permanent begin changing once the empath stops overextending themselves to keep them alive. People around them often react strongly to this transformation because they became comfortable with unlimited access to the empath's emotional labor. The friend who could always vent for hours suddenly hears the word no. The family member who depended on emotional support without giving any back notices distance. The partner who enjoyed endless understanding suddenly encounters boundaries. And because people dislike losing access to comfort they once took for granted, they accuse the empath of changing. They say things like, "You're different now," or "You used to care more." But what they really mean is that the empath stopped abandoning themselves to make others comfortable. The empath stopped existing solely as emotional support for everyone else's problems. What makes this stage emotionally difficult is that the empath often feels guilty for changing. Even when boundaries are healthy and necessary, years of conditioning make self-protection feel selfish. The empath may question themselves constantly at first. They may wonder if they are becoming cold or uncaring. They may feel anxiety after saying no because they spent most of their life believing their value came from emotional availability. This creates an intense inner conflict. One part of them longs for peace and balance, while another part fears disappointing people. The guilt can feel overwhelming in the beginning, especially when others react negatively to boundaries. But over time, the empath begins recognizing something important. Guilt does not always mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it simply means you are breaking an unhealthy pattern. From a psychological perspective, this transformation often resembles grief. The empath grieves the old version of themselves because that identity shaped their entire life. They mourn the relationships that disappear once they stop overgiving. They mourn the illusion that endless sacrifice could eventually create healthy love. They mourn the years spent emotionally exhausting themselves for people who rarely noticed the cost. And perhaps most painfully, they mourn how long they ignored their own needs while trying to save everyone else. This grief arrives in waves. Some days the empath feels strong and free. Other days they miss the familiar role of being needed. Healing is rarely linear, especially for people whose identity was built around emotional caretaking. Eventually, though, something beautiful begins happening. The empath starts experiencing peace in ways they never imagined possible. Their nervous system slowly calms down. The constant emotional pressure begins fading. They no longer wake up carrying the weight of everyone else's problems before their own day even starts. For many empaths, this emotional awakening also creates physical relief. Years of absorbing stress often manifest through the body. Chronic fatigue, headaches, tension, digestive problems, unexplained exhaustion, and emotional burnout become normal after carrying invisible emotional weight for too long. Once the empath stops absorbing energy that was never theirs to carry, the body finally gets a chance to rest. It feels like putting down heavy bags they forgot they were holding. One of the most important lessons the awakened empath learns is the difference between helping and enabling. Before, they often rescued people from consequences because they hated seeing suffering. But eventually they understand that constantly saving someone from accountability can actually prevent growth. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is step back and allow people to face the results of their own choices. That realization feels difficult at first because empaths naturally want to protect people from pain. But wisdom teaches them that growth often requires discomfort. Shielding someone from every hardship may feel loving in the moment, but it can quietly keep unhealthy cycles alive for years. There is a concept in spiritual philosophy that describes a form of compassion so excessive that it unintentionally creates more suffering. The empath understands this deeply once they awaken. They realize that constantly overextending themselves did not heal everyone around them. In many cases, it only created emotional dependency. Some people never learned emotional responsibility because the empath was always there cleaning up the emotional mess. Once the empath steps back, those people are finally forced to confront themselves honestly. And although that process may create tension, it ultimately allows healthier relationships to form. Real love cannot survive on one person constantly sacrificing themselves while the other only receives. As the empath becomes stronger emotionally, they also become more selective about where their energy goes. This does not mean they stop loving people. It means they stop giving unlimited access to people who repeatedly drain them. They become more observant about emotional patterns. They notice manipulation faster. They recognize one-sided dynamics earlier. They trust their intuition more deeply because they finally understand how accurate it always was. In the past, they ignored red flags because they wanted to believe everyone had good intentions. Now they understand that compassion without discernment creates vulnerability to emotional exploitation. So they begin protecting their energy with the same seriousness they once protected everyone else's feelings. This stage can feel lonely because the empath often outgrows environments and relationships that once defined their life. They may spend more time alone, not from bitterness, but from a desire for peace. Solitude becomes healing instead of painful. Silence becomes comforting instead of empty. The empath no longer feels desperate to maintain connections that cost them their emotional stability. They become comfortable disappointing people who only valued them for what they provided. That confidence does not appear overnight, but slowly it grows stronger. And with every healthy boundary they maintain, they rebuild trust within themselves. The awakened empath also begins understanding something they never fully believed before. Their sensitivity is not a weakness. It never was. The problem was never their ability to feel deeply. The problem was the absence of boundaries around that sensitivity. Without protection, empathy turns into emotional drowning. But with wisdom, balance, and self-respect, empathy becomes one of the most powerful forms of human understanding. The empath no longer fears their gift because they finally know how to carry it without letting it consume them. They stop apologizing for needing rest. They stop explaining every boundary repeatedly. They stop believing they must earn love through endless emotional labor. Over time, the empath becomes calmer, steadier, and emotionally clearer than ever before. They still care deeply, but they are no longer controlled by guilt. They still support people, but not at the expense of their own peace. They still love with intensity, but they no longer disappear inside relationships. And perhaps most importantly, they finally understand that saying no does not make them cruel. Choosing themselves does not make them selfish. Protecting their energy does not make them cold. It makes them healthy. It makes them balanced. It makes them emotionally honest for the first time in their life. In the end, the empath does not lose their ability to care. They simply learn that their kindness deserves direction, balance, and protection. For too long, they believed love meant carrying everyone else while ignoring themselves. But true growth begins the moment they understand that compassion should never require self-neglect. The awakening is not about becoming distant or emotionless. It is about finally recognizing their own value after years of placing everyone else first. As they move forward, the empath still feels deeply, still understands others, and still brings comfort to people around them. The difference is that they no longer abandon themselves in the process. They learn to set boundaries without guilt, to walk away from draining situations without fear, and to protect their peace without apologizing for it. What once looked like emotional exhaustion slowly becomes emotional wisdom. And maybe that is the real transformation. The empath stops seeing their sensitivity as something that must be sacrificed for others and begins seeing it as a gift that also deserves care. They realize they were never meant to carry the entire world alone. They were meant to live, connect, love, and grow while still remaining connected to themselves. That is not the loss of empathy. It is the moment empathy finally becomes healthy, balanced, and strong.